she insulted an ordinary customer, only to discover he owned the restaurant and was none other than Clint Eastwood. When a struggling waitress let her frustration get the best of her, she had no idea she was talking down to a Hollywood legend. But Clint didn't react the way she expected. Instead, he taught her a lesson she'd never forget. Before we continue this incredible story, let us know where you're watching from. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel because tomorrow we have another inspiring story you won't want to miss. The lunch rush at Sierra Grill was in full swing, and Megan felt like she was drowning. The small but bustling restaurant in Carmel-by-the-Sea, California, had a charm that drew in regulars and tourists alike. Rustic yet modern, cozy yet always hectic. And today was an absolute disaster. From the moment Megan had clocked in, everything had gone wrong. Orders were piling up, customers were impatient, and her coworkers were just as frazzled as she was. She had already dealt with 3 separate complaints about undercooked steaks, 2 tables demanding extra dressing, and 1 couple arguing over their bill as if she were some sort of courtroom mediator. As she rushed past the counter, her coworker Danny called out, "Megan, table 6 is still waiting on their drinks." Megan didn't even glance up from her notepad, hastily scribbling another order. "I'm only one person, Danny," she snapped, more irritated than she meant to sound. She wasn't usually this bitter, but today had tested every ounce of patience she had left. And the worst part? The tips. She had smiled, she had hustled, she had even thrown in the occasional joke when she had the energy. But the generosity of customers today was abysmal. 3 tables in a row had stiffed her, and another had left behind a handful of loose change, as if she should be grateful for their spare quarters. As she wiped down a nearby table, the bell above the entrance jingled softly. She barely looked up as an older man stepped inside, moving with a slow, deliberate ease. The second she caught a glimpse of his slightly wrinkled flannel, worn-out jeans, and a dusty old Stetson hat resting on his head, she made a silent judgment. "Great," she thought, sighing internally. "Another one of those." She had seen his type before. Older, probably a small-town rancher type, someone who would order a coffee and a burger, take up space for an hour, and leave her a crumpled dollar bill as a tip. Maybe 2 if she was lucky. Megan turned to grab a tray of drinks for another table, but before she could avoid the inevitable, her coworker nudged her. "Table 12 is yours," Danny whispered. Megan bit back a groan. Just what she needed. One more difficult customer on a day that was already pushing her to the edge. Plastering on the most tolerable smile she could manage, she grabbed her notepad and approached his table. "What can I get you today?" she asked, her tone polite but edged with impatience. The man looked up at her, and for the first time, she hesitated. His eyes, sharp, calculating, and piercing, held a kind of quiet authority that caught her off guard. For a second, she felt like he was seeing right through her, but she quickly pushed the thought aside. "Just a burger," he said, his voice low and gravelly, carrying a weight that seemed to command respect without effort. Megan nodded quickly, scribbling it down. "Burger, got it. Anything else?" "No, ma'am," he said simply, tipping his hat slightly. She almost laughed at that. Ma'am? She was 23, not 50. The title felt misplaced, almost absurd. But instead of appreciating the old-fashioned politeness, Megan found herself rolling her eyes as she turned away, muttering under her breath, "Ma'am? Really?" As she pushed through the swinging doors to the kitchen, something about the interaction nagged at her. She couldn't quite put her finger on it, but there was something different about this guy. He wasn't loud or demanding like the rest of the customers. He didn't complain, didn't bark orders, didn't even seem in a rush. He was just there, watching, waiting. She shook the thought off. He was just another customer, another order, another dollar. At least, that's what she thought. But what Megan didn't know, what she couldn't have known, was that this man wasn't just any customer. He wasn't just another rancher passing through town. He was Clint Eastwood, and she had just made a very, very big mistake. Megan moved through the restaurant floor like she was running an obstacle course, dodging chairs, sidestepping frantic co-workers, and barely keeping her balance as she delivered plates to impatient customers. She didn't have time to think about the older man at table 12. He was just another order, another seat filled. But something about him kept creeping into her mind. It wasn't that he was difficult. Quite the opposite, actually. He was the only customer that hadn't bombarded her with requests or complaints. No demands for extra sauce, no special instructions, no loud sighs when she took more than a minute to refill a drink. He was patient, observant, and something about that irked her. When she finally grabbed his plate from the kitchen and made her way back to his table, she placed the burger down with slightly less care than she usually gave. The plate clattered softly against the wood. "Here you go," she said, brushing a loose strand of hair from her face and setting down a ketchup bottle beside his meal. "Anything else?" The man glanced at the burger, then looked back up at her, his gaze steady and unreadable. "No," he said simply. "This looks just fine, thank you." His tone was polite, but there was something about the way he spoke that made Megan hesitate. It wasn't that he was particularly friendly, nor was he cold, just firm. He didn't carry the same arrogance as some of her other customers, but his presence felt heavy, as if the room subtly shifted to acknowledge that he was there. For reasons she couldn't explain, Megan didn't walk away immediately. Instead, she lingered at the table, tapping her pen against her notepad. "You're not from around here, are you?" she asked, arching an eyebrow as she leaned slightly against the chair opposite him. The man looked up from his plate, chewing thoughtfully before setting his burger down. His eyes held a hint of amusement. "No," he admitted, dabbing his mouth with a napkin. "I'm not." "Thought so," she smirked, glancing at his worn boots and Stetson hat. The hat gave it away. "Looks like you just stepped out of an old Western movie." For the first time since he walked in, the man cracked a small, almost imperceptible smile. Something like that. Megan expected him to get defensive or brush her off. She had been a waitress long enough to know that most men, especially older ones, didn't like to be teased. But this one? He didn't bite. That frustrated her more than she cared to admit. "Well," she said, pushing herself off the chair, "enjoy your meal, cowboy." She turned on her heel, feeling like she had gotten the last word, but as she walked away, she felt something odd. His eyes watching her. Not in a creepy way, not like some of the customers who stared too long. No, this was different. It was as if he was evaluating her, assessing her, as if he knew something she didn't. And that, for the first time all day, made her uncomfortable. As the lunch rush died down, Megan finally got a moment to catch her breath. She leaned against the counter, scrolling through her phone, keeping an eye on her tables but allowing herself a moment of peace. "You ever get the feeling that someone's watching you?" she muttered to her coworker Danny, who was wiping down a nearby table. Danny glanced up. "What?" Megan jerked her chin toward table 12. "That guy. The cowboy. He's weird." Danny followed her gaze and frowned slightly. "Weird how?" "I don't know," Megan said, lowering her voice. "He's just sitting there, not in a hurry, not scrolling through his phone, just watching everything." Danny studied him for a second, then shrugged. "He looks familiar." Megan scoffed. "Yeah, right." "I'm serious," Danny insisted. "Like I've seen him before, maybe on TV?" Megan rolled her eyes. "If he's famous, then I'm the Queen of England." Danny smirked. "Well, Your Majesty, I think you're wrong about him." Megan waved her off, turning her attention back to her phone. Eventually, the man finished his meal. Megan grabbed the check and walked over, trying to keep the interaction brief. "Here's your check," she said, setting it down. "Whenever you're ready." The man glanced at the check but didn't immediately reach for it. Instead, he looked up at her, his sharp eyes locking onto hers with unsettling precision. "Do you enjoy your job?" he asked, his voice calm but deliberate. The question caught her off guard. Megan hesitated, her practiced waitress smile faltering. "It's fine," she answered with a shrug. "It's a job, you know." The man nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. "The job's what you make of it," he said after a moment. Megan felt a twinge of irritation at the unsolicited wisdom. Well, today's been rough, she said, crossing her arms. Not everyone gets to sit around eating burgers and handing out life advice. To her surprise, the man didn't seem offended. Instead, he leaned back slightly in his chair, a faint smile playing on his lips. Fair enough, he said. But sometimes how you treat people in those moments says more about you than you think. Megan's cheeks flushed. Was he lecturing her? Who was this guy? She opened her mouth to fire back a retort, but before she could, he stood up and reached for his wallet. I'll leave you with that thought, he said, placing a few bills on the table. Thanks for the meal. And just like that, he turned toward the door. Megan muttered under her breath, yeah, whatever, cowboy. But then, something happened. The manager, Carol, rushed out from the back, her face lighting up. Mr. Eastwood, she exclaimed, extending her hand enthusiastically. I wasn't expecting you today. Megan froze. Mr. Eastwood? She whipped her head toward the man, her stomach dropping as realization hit her like a freight train. No way. The man turned back slightly, shaking Carol's hand. But just before walking out the door, his gaze met Megan's again. This time, there was something different in his expression. Something knowing. And in that moment, Megan realized she hadn't just insulted an ordinary customer. She had insulted Clint Eastwood, the owner of the restaurant. Megan stood frozen, her notepad clutched so tightly in her hands that the edges began to crinkle. Her heart pounded against her ribs as she replayed every single word she had just said to Clint Eastwood. The Clint Eastwood. Her snarky comments, her dismissive attitude, the eye rolls, the muttered whatever cowboy as he walked away. Every single moment came crashing down on her like a tidal wave, and she felt her stomach twist into a tight knot of regret. Carol, oblivious to Megan's internal breakdown, was practically beaming. He's been so busy lately, she gushed, still watching Clint as he disappeared out the door. I haven't seen him in weeks. I'm glad he finally stopped by. Megan barely heard her. She could still feel his gaze lingering in her memory, that quiet, knowing expression that said, I saw exactly who you are today. She had spent 2 years working at this restaurant, and not once had she ever stopped to wonder who actually owned the place. She had overheard stories from other staff about how the owner was hands-on, about how he cared about every detail of the place, but she never paid attention. To her, this was just another stop along the way, a temporary gig until she figured out what she really wanted to do. Now, that attitude had just come back to bite her. Danny nudged her, lowering her voice. Megan, did you know that was Clint Eastwood? Megan swallowed hard, her throat suddenly dry. No, she muttered. I didn't. Danny gave her a half smirk, half grimace. Oof. That's rough. Carol finally turned back toward the restaurant, still smiling, and clapped her hands together. Well, she said, you all know what that means. Mr. Eastwood notices things. He's picky about how we treat customers, how the place runs. He built this restaurant to be something special, not just another greasy spoon. She glanced around at the staff, her eyes sharp. So, if any of you weren't bringing your best today, I'd start thinking real hard about that. Megan felt a sharp stab of anxiety. Did Clint think she was a bad employee? Would he say something? Would she be fired before the next shift even started? No, he wouldn't fire her. He couldn't, right? He didn't seem the type to be vengeful, but he had to be disappointed in her. That made it worse somehow. She needed to do something. Hey, Carol? Megan blurted before she could stop herself. Carol turned. Yeah? Megan hesitated, her face burning with embarrassment, but forced herself to push through. Did Mr. Eastwood say anything about me? Carol frowned slightly, thinking. No, she said, shaking her head. Megan let out a breath she didn't even realize she'd been holding. No reason, she muttered, just curious. But Carol wasn't the only one looking at her now. Danny was watching her closely, an amused glint in her eye. You're freaking out, aren't you? She said. Megan groaned, running a hand through her hair. Obviously, Danny chuckled. I mean, I would be too. You kind of treated him like a senile old man. Thank you, Danny, that helped so much, Megan deadpanned. I live to serve. Megan sighed and glanced back at the door, half expecting Clint to walk back in. But he was gone. The worst part? He hadn't even looked mad. Disappointed, maybe. Like he had been testing her and she had failed. And for some reason, that feeling stuck with her for the rest of the day. By the time Megan got home that night, she was exhausted. She collapsed onto her couch, her mind still replaying the events of the day. She had made a complete fool of herself, and there was nothing she could do to take it back. After a long moment, she pulled out her phone and, against her better judgment, Googled Clint Eastwood. Hundreds of articles, photos, and interviews flooded the screen. Awards, iconic movie roles, even his mayorship of Carmel by the Sea. She clicked on an article about Sierra Grill, skimming through a piece that highlighted why he had opened the restaurant in the first place. I wanted to build a place where people felt welcome, a place with good food, good company, and respect. Megan stared at the words. She had been working in his restaurant for 2 years, and she had shown him none. Her stomach twisted. What if he did remember her attitude? What if he did decide she wasn't worth keeping around? The thought sent a jolt of panic through her. She couldn't afford to lose this job. Her rent was due in 2 weeks, and her student loans weren't going to magically disappear. She had to make it right. Even if it was too late to undo what she had done, she needed to at least show that she wasn't the careless, indifferent person Clint had met today. Megan didn't sleep much that night. Her mind raced, shifting between anxiety and determination. She didn't know how exactly she was going to fix things. But she knew one thing for certain. If Clint Eastwood ever walked into her section again, she would not make the same mistake twice. The next day, Megan walked into Sierra Grill with a tight knot of anxiety sitting heavy in her stomach. She had barely slept, tossing and turning, replaying every word she had said to Clint Eastwood and every single way she had embarrassed herself. She had let frustration get the best of her, and instead of treating him with the same respect she gave other customers, she had dismissed him, judged him, and spoken to him like he was just another forgettable patron. Now she was bracing for the fallout. As she walked through the kitchen, Carol was already barking orders, making sure the early lunch shift was running smoothly. Megan kept her head down, avoiding eye contact, unsure if Clint had called or sent a message about her behavior. But Carol didn't say anything. Maybe he really doesn't care, Megan thought. Maybe I was just another face to him, just another bad waitress having a bad day. For some reason, that didn't make her feel better. She spent the first half of her shift working harder than she ever had before. She smiled at customers. Real smiles, not the ones she usually faked. She asked people if they needed refills before they had to ask. She didn't roll her eyes at a single ridiculous request. And when an elderly man accidentally knocked his drink onto the floor, Megan didn't sigh or groan. She grabbed a rag, knelt down, and said with a genuine laugh, "Hey, it happens to the best of us." She could feel the shift. For the first time in a long time, she wasn't just going through the motions. She actually cared. But the real test came just after noon. The restaurant had filled up with the usual lunchtime crowd, locals, a few tourists, and businessmen who worked nearby. The hum of conversation blended with the clatter of plates and the sizzling sounds from the kitchen. Megan was clearing a table near the window when she heard a familiar gravelly voice. "Well, looks like you're busy today." She turned sharply, her breath catching in her throat. There he was, Clint Eastwood, standing by the counter, hands casually tucked into the pockets of his jeans, watching her with that same unreadable expression. For a split second, Megan considered bolting into the kitchen. But no, she wasn't going to run from this. She took a steadying breath, forcing herself to walk over, her heart pounding so hard she was sure he could hear it. "Mr. Eastwood?" she said, her voice more nervous than she'd like. I didn't know you'd be back so soon." He tilted his head slightly. "I like to check in on my places from time to time. Keeps everyone on their toes." Megan swallowed. She had no idea if that was a subtle jab at her behavior yesterday or just a casual statement, but either way, she felt her entire body stiffen. "Right," she said quickly, nodding. "Well, everything's running great today." Clint glanced around the restaurant, his sharp eyes scanning the tables, the staff, the customers. Then he looked back at her. "I see that," he said. Then, after a pause, "But you seem a little tense." She froze. Of course he noticed. He probably noticed everything. Before she could stop herself, she blurted, "Look, about yesterday." He held up a hand, stopping her mid-sentence. "No need to apologize," he said calmly. "I'm not here to make your life harder." She blinked, caught off guard. He wasn't? She had spent the last 24 hours bracing for some kind of consequence, getting fired, getting called out, something. But now, he was standing here, acting like it didn't even matter. "But," he continued, his voice steady, "I do think there's a lesson here." Megan tensed. "You never know who you're talking to," Clint said simply, "or what they might be going through." Megan's throat tightened. He wasn't angry. He wasn't mocking her. He was teaching her. A lump formed in her throat. She had spent so much time resenting the job, snapping at customers in her head, assuming the worst about people before they even had a chance. And Clint, he had seen that. "Sometimes," he continued, "how you treat people in your worst moments says more about you than how you act when things are easy." She felt her face turn red. How many times had she brushed off a customer's needs just because she was tired? How many times had she assumed someone wasn't worth her time based on nothing but a first impression? Too many. She wanted to tell him she understood, that she got it now, that she knew she had messed up and that she wanted to be better. But all she could manage was a quiet, "Thank you." Clint gave her a small, knowing smile. "You're welcome." Then, with a nod, he turned and walked toward the exit. Megan stood there, her entire body still buzzing with adrenaline. She had been dreading this moment, and yet, somehow, it wasn't what she expected at all. Clint Eastwood wasn't holding a grudge. He wasn't the type to rub it in. But he was the type to teach a lesson and let you decide what to do with it. As she watched him disappear through the door, Megan felt something shift deep inside her. She didn't just want to do better today. She wanted to do better every day. Because Clint was right, every interaction is an opportunity. And from this moment on, she wasn't going to waste another one. For the rest of her shift, Megan couldn't shake Clint Eastwood's words from her mind. They lingered like an echo, replaying in her head as she moved from table to table, wiping counters, refilling drinks, and greeting customers with a smile that, for the first time in a long time, actually felt real. You never know who you're talking to. She had assumed so much about him. She had let frustration dictate her attitude, let exhaustion shape her interactions. And yet, Clint hadn't scolded her, hadn't embarrassed her in front of her co-workers, hadn't stormed into the kitchen demanding her termination. Instead, he had done something far more impactful. He had challenged her. And the more she thought about it, the more she realized he was right. It wasn't just about recognizing who someone was. It was about recognizing their humanity. For months, maybe even years, Megan had been operating on autopilot, viewing every customer as just another task to get through, another order to deliver, another face she'd forget by the time they walked out the door. But today, she saw them differently. By the time the lunch rush had ended, Megan felt something she hadn't in a long time. Pride, not just in the work itself, but in the way she was doing it. She wasn't rolling her eyes when an elderly man took too long counting change. She wasn't sighing when a mother asked for an extra spoon for her toddler. She wasn't muttering under her breath when a group of teenagers left a messy table. Instead, she was being present, being better. And the strangest part? It didn't feel like extra work. It just felt right. She had just finished wiping down a booth when Carol's voice rang through the dining area. "Megan, got a second?" Her stomach clenched instinctively. For one awful moment, she thought this was it, that Clint had changed his mind, that he had called Carol after all, that she was about to be let go. She forced a nod, quickly drying her hands on her apron before following Carol into the small back office. The second the door shut, Megan braced herself. Instead, Carol turned to her with an approving nod. "You've been doing great today." Megan blinked, caught off guard. I have?" Carol folded her arms, leaning against the desk. "Yeah, I've been watching. And I've been hearing things too." Megan's heart hammered. "Hearing what?" Carol smirked. "Good things." She reached over to her desk and picked up a comment card. Megan recognized it immediately. Customers could fill them out and drop them in a small box near the entrance. Most of them were ignored, but Carol always made it a point to read the ones with genuine feedback. Carol handed it to Megan. She hesitated before looking down at the card, her eyes scanning the neatly written words. "Megan was incredible today, attentive, kind, and made our experience here a great one. People like her make a difference in customer service." Her throat tightened. She wasn't sure whether to laugh or cry. Instead, she looked up at Carol, still in disbelief. This is about me?" Carol chuckled. "Who else?" Megan shook her head, gripping the card tightly as she exhaled. I don't know what to say." Carol smiled. "You don't have to say anything, just keep it up." And with that, she walked back to the kitchen, leaving Megan standing in the office, staring down at the card in her hands. Something inside her shifted again. This wasn't just about fixing a mistake anymore. It was about becoming someone she could be proud of. She folded the comment card carefully and slipped it into her apron pocket. Maybe, for the first time in a long time, she was finally on the right path. That night, as Megan walked home, the weight of the comment card in her pocket felt heavier than it should have. It wasn't the card itself, but what it represented. A shift, a realization, a second chance. For so long, she had seen this job as just a means to an end, a paycheck, a survival tool, something to tolerate rather than embrace. But Clint Eastwood had shown her something she hadn't wanted to admit. Her attitude had been shaping her reality. She had spent so much time blaming the job, the customers, the long hours. But in the end, she had been the one deciding how each day played out. And that realization, it stuck with her, embedded itself deep in her chest, like a lesson she could no longer ignore. By the time she reached her small apartment, she felt exhausted, not just physically, but mentally. Everything that had happened in the past 48 hours had cracked something open inside her, something she wasn't sure she could ever close again. She dropped her keys on the counter, poured herself a glass of water, and sat down at the tiny kitchen table, her eyes flicking down to the folded comment card still tucked in her pocket. Slowly, she pulled it out, smoothing the paper against the tabletop. Megan was incredible today. Attentive, kind, and made our experience here a great one. People like her make a difference in customer service. A soft, breathless laugh escaped her. People like her. She had never thought of herself as someone who could make a difference. But maybe she could. The next morning, she woke up with something unfamiliar burning in her chest. Purpose. When she arrived at the Sierra Grill, she felt the difference immediately. The air smelled the same. Grilled burgers, fresh coffee, a hint of lemon cleaner from the tables. But she wasn't the same. And neither was the way she carried herself. Instead of dreading the morning rush, she welcomed it. Instead of letting exhaustion turn to irritation, she reminded herself of what Clint had said. You never know who you're talking to. She noticed things she hadn't before. The way a man in his 70s lingered over his coffee, staring out the window like he was lost in memory. The way a mother kept nervously checking her phone, barely touching her plate. The way a teenager hesitated before ordering, his voice uncertain, as if he wasn't used to being spoken to kindly. Every table held a story, and for the first time in her life, Megan wanted to hear them. During her break, she stood behind the counter refilling a tray of silverware when Carol walked over. "You keep this up and I'm going to have to give you a raise," Carol said with a smirk. Megan chuckled, but the warmth in her chest was real. "I wouldn't say no to that." Carol studied her for a moment, then leaned in slightly. You know, Clint Eastwood has been coming here for years. He's seen dozens of servers come and go, but yesterday, when he stopped by again, he asked about you. Megan's stomach tightened. What did he say? Carol smiled. Just asked how you were doing, said he had a good feeling about you. Megan exhaled slowly, her fingers gripping the edge of the counter. A good feeling. Coming from Clint Eastwood, that was no small thing. She didn't know if she'd ever see him again. Didn't know if he'd ever walk back into Sierra Grill and sit at one of her tables. But if he did, she'd be ready. Because this time, she wouldn't just see him. She'd see everyone. A week passed, then another. Megan settled into her new rhythm at Sierra Grill, and though the job hadn't changed, she had. She no longer rushed through her shifts just to get to the end of the day. Instead, she found herself in the moment, making small talk with customers, greeting regulars by name, and even laughing with her coworkers between the madness of the lunch rush. And for the first time in a long time, she felt proud of the work she did. One afternoon, as she was refilling a customer's coffee, the door swung open and a familiar presence stepped inside. Megan froze. Clint Eastwood. He strolled in like he belonged there, which, of course, he did. He owned the place. But something about the way he carried himself made the restaurant feel smaller, like the walls drew in closer around him. His gaze swept over the room, calm but observant, the same way it had that first day. Megan felt a strange mix of nerves and excitement twist in her stomach. He was back, and this time she was ready. She took a deep breath, smoothed the front of her apron, and walked over to his table, standing just a little straighter than before. "Welcome back," she said with a smile, her voice steady but warm. Clint looked up at her, those sharp eyes studying her carefully, as if he were searching for something. A flicker of amusement crossed his face. "Well now," he said, setting his hat down on the table, "you look different." Megan's smile grew. "Guess I had a good reason to change." He gave a small nod, as if he approved of that answer. "I'll have the same thing as last time." "Burger, no onions, medium well?" she asked, tilting her head slightly. His lips curled into that faint, knowing smile. "You remember." Megan shrugged playfully. "I try to learn from my mistakes." Clint chuckled. A low, quiet sound, but one that sent a strange sense of accomplishment through her. As she walked back to the kitchen, she caught Carol watching her with a raised eyebrow. "What?" Megan asked. Carol smirked. "Nothing. Just funny how life works, isn't it?" Megan glanced over her shoulder at Clint, who was now casually scanning the menu, even though she knew he'd already made up his mind. Yeah, it really was. Minutes later, she brought out his order, this time setting it down with care. "Anything else?" she asked. Clint looked up at her, this time more serious. "Yeah." "Got a minute to sit?" Megan hesitated, glancing around the restaurant. It was slowing down. There weren't many tables left to serve. She nodded. "Yeah, I've got a minute." She slid into the booth across from him, unsure what to expect. Clint took a measured bite of his burger before setting it down, wiping his hands on a napkin. "You know," he started, his tone as casual as if they were discussing the weather, "I've been coming here for years. Built this place up with a lot of good people, and I've seen plenty of folks come and go." Megan swallowed, waiting. "But not many change," he continued, his eyes locking onto hers. "Not like you did." A lump formed in Megan's throat. She wasn't sure why, but his words mattered. Clint leaned forward slightly, resting his arms on the table. "Most people don't get second chances, Megan, but when they do, not everyone knows what to do with them." He paused. "You do." Megan exhaled slowly. There it was. That thing she had been feeling inside of her for weeks now. That shift. That realization. She had been given a second chance, and instead of wasting it, she had embraced it. She wasn't just waiting tables anymore. She was building something. Megan straightened in her seat and met Clint's gaze. "Thank you," she said sincerely. Clint nodded once. "Don't thank me," he said. "Just keep going." And with that, he picked up his burger and took another bite, as if he hadn't just changed her life all over again. As Clint Eastwood finished his meal and left Sierra Grill that afternoon, Megan sat in silence for a few moments, staring at the empty seat where he had just been. His words still echoed in her mind. Most people don't get second chances, but when they do, not everyone knows what to do with them. You do. She had never thought of herself as someone who wasted opportunities, but looking back, she realized how much of her time had been spent coasting, going through the motions, without purpose, without care. That changed now. The rest of the day flew by, and as Megan wiped down the last table before closing, she felt lighter than she had in months. She was no longer just working for a paycheck. She was working with intention. She wasn't just showing up, she was present. Carol noticed. "Whatever spell Clint Eastwood put on you," she teased as they locked up the restaurant. "I think we should bottle it up and sell it." Megan laughed but shook her head. "It wasn't a spell," she said thoughtfully, "just perspective." Carol gave her a knowing look. "Well, whatever it is, you've become one of the best servers here. And honestly, I think you could be more than that." Megan blinked, caught off guard. "What do you mean?" Carol leaned against the counter, arms crossed. "I mean, if you're looking for something more, we've got a management position opening soon. I think you'd be great at it." Megan's heart skipped a beat. A few weeks ago, she would have laughed at the idea. Her? A manager? She had barely cared enough to make it through her shifts, but now she felt different. Now she knew she was capable of more. "I'll think about it," she said with a small, uncertain smile. Carol grinned. "You do that." That night, Megan lay in bed staring at the ceiling, replaying the last few weeks in her mind. She thought about how close she had been to making a terrible mistake, brushing off a man who had turned out to be not just someone, but someone who saw potential in her. She thought about the lessons Clint had taught her, not just with his words, but with the way he carried himself, with patience, with quiet confidence, with respect for every moment and every person he encountered. And she thought about how different she felt now, how much she wanted to keep growing, not just as an employee, but as a person. She picked up her phone, opened a new note, and typed out something she never wanted to forget. "Every interaction is an opportunity. Use it well." It wasn't just something Clint Eastwood had said, it was a new way of looking at the world. And she wasn't going to waste it. A few weeks later, Megan was in the middle of a busy lunch shift when she heard a familiar voice. "Well, look at that. Seems like you're still here." She turned around, and there he was, Clint Eastwood, standing by the entrance, his hat in one hand, his sharp gaze watching her with amusement. Megan smiled, walking up to him without hesitation. "You know, you have a habit of showing up when I least expect it." He chuckled. "That's how I like it." She gestured to a table. "Your usual seat?" He nodded, and as she led him over, she couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. This time there was no nervousness, no tension, just respect. After taking his order, she lingered for a moment. "Hey, Clint," she said, and he looked up. She took a breath. "I just wanted to say thank you for everything." His expression softened slightly. "You don't owe me thanks," he said. "You did the hard part. You made the change." Megan nodded, smiling to herself. He was right, and she wasn't stopping now. Megan's story is more than just an amusing encounter with a Hollywood legend. It's a powerful reminder of how the smallest moments can lead to the biggest transformations. In a world where people rush through their days, focused on their own struggles and frustrations, it's easy to overlook the impact we have on others. But as Megan learned, every interaction, no matter how fleeting, is an opportunity. At the start of her shift, Megan was just another overworked, underappreciated waitress trying to get through the day. She was frustrated, exhausted, and on the verge of letting her bitterness define her. She had no idea that the quiet man at table 12 would change the way she saw herself, her job, and her future. But that's exactly what happened. The beauty of this story lies in its unexpected lesson. You never know who you're talking to. You never know if the person you dismiss, ignore, or treat with impatience might be someone who has the power to change your life. Not because they're famous or wealthy, but because they see something in you that you don't yet see in yourself. We live in a time where snap judgments are made in an instant. We judge people based on their appearance, their clothing, their demeanor. Megan assumed Clint Eastwood was just another elderly man who would leave a meager tip and take up space at her table. She let frustration cloud her professionalism, and in doing so, she nearly missed a life-changing lesson. How often do we do the same? How many times do we brush people off, thinking they have nothing to offer us? How many opportunities do we let slip through our fingers simply because we're too caught up in our own frustrations to see them for what they are? This story is a wake-up call. First impressions matter, and not just for the people we're serving, working with, or passing by. They matter for us. The way we treat others isn't just a reflection of them, it's a reflection of who we are. One of the most profound lessons Clint Eastwood imparted wasn't just about respect, it was about seizing every moment as a chance to be better. Megan could have ignored his words. She could have brushed off the entire experience and gone right back to her usual routine. But she didn't. She took the lesson to heart, and in doing so, she unlocked something greater within herself. She realized she was capable of more, not just in her job, but in the way she approached life. That's a lesson we can all take with us. Whether you're in customer service, running a business, or just interacting with strangers on a daily basis, the way you treat people matters. Every moment is an opportunity to leave a positive impression, to grow, to show kindness, and to build a reputation that speaks louder than words. Another crucial takeaway from this story is the importance of humility. Clint Eastwood could have easily revealed his identity the moment Megan insulted him. He could have embarrassed her, called her out, or even had her fired. But he didn't. Instead, he taught her a lesson through patience and quiet wisdom. He gave her a chance to recognize her own shortcomings and correct them on her own. That's what made the lesson so powerful. Megan wasn't forced to change. She chose to change. In today's world, where cancel culture and instant outrage dominate, Clint's approach is refreshing. Instead of immediately punishing someone for their mistakes, he offered her a second chance, a rare gift in our fast-paced, judgment-heavy society. And Megan didn't waste it. Megan's journey didn't just end with a lesson. It led to a transformation. She took the wisdom she gained and applied it. She improved her attitude, took pride in her work, and even found herself on the path to a promotion. So now the question is, what about you? Have you ever had a moment where you realized you needed to change? Have you ever been given an opportunity to grow but let it pass by? What if today is that moment for you? Let this story serve as your reminder. Treat people with respect. Work hard even when no one is watching. Be open to learning lessons in the most unexpected places. Because you never know when the next person you meet might just be the one who changes your life. If this story resonated with you, don't forget to hit that like button and share it with someone who could use a little inspiration today. And if you want to hear more powerful, real-life stories like this, make sure to subscribe to the channel so you never miss a video. Because sometimes the greatest lessons come from the most unexpected places. And every moment, every interaction is a chance to be better.